The galaxy was a patchwork quilt of civilizations, each stitched together by treaties and diplomacy that strained to contain the ever-present threat of war. Among these civilizations were the Deathworlders, beings whose origins lay on planets deemed uninhabitable by the galaxy's standards. They were the descendants of survivors, those who had endured crushing gravity, violent storms, and ecosystems designed to kill. To outsiders, Deathworlders were an enigma, simultaneously revered and feared, yet they wore their civility like a ceremonial mask, careful not to bear too much of what lay beneath. Elias Wrath was a diplomat, one of the Deathworlders tasked with maintaining the fragile illusion of harmony. He stood in the grand chambers of the Galactic Council, an arena of glittering opulence where words often carried more weight than deeds. Elias was tall and broad-shouldered, his physicality tempered by a measured voice and sharp intellect. His every movement was deliberate, as though he feared his natural strength might betray the image he was there to project. Today, however, restraint felt heavier than usual. He clenched his jaw as he listened to Representative Kale Vestran of the Harith Collective deliver a speech dripping with condescension. The Harith were an avian species, their hollow-boned frames a sharp contrast to Elias's solidity. Kale's gilded feathers shimmered in the light, a stark reminder of how much of the galaxy valued appearances over substance. The Deathworlders, Kale intoned, his voice a silken barb, have always been a peculiar addition to our collective. Their contributions to the galactic peace are of course appreciated. But we must acknowledge the risk inherent in trusting a species whose instincts are so primal. The chamber rippled with murmurs, some disapproving, others amused. Elias said nothing, his expression an unreadable mask, but his fingers dug into the edge of his podium. After the session adjourned, Elias returned to his quarters, where Commander Lena Voss awaited him. Unlike Elias, Lena had no patience for diplomatic theater. She was a soldier through and through, her no-nonsense demeanor mirrored in the crisp precision of her uniform. "They're testing us," Lena said, skipping formalities as she paced the room. That little speech was a prelude, not a provocation. Elias sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Kale's always been a snake, but you're right. This feels coordinated." "It is," Lena said, tossing a datapad onto the table. The screen displayed footage from a Deathworlder mining colony on Eris 7, now a smoldering ruin. The attack had left thousands dead, their advanced defenses inexplicably disabled before the enemy descended. Harith ships were spotted leaving the sector hours before the attack. "They think they've covered their tracks, but we know better." Elias stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He thought of the families who had lived there, children who had played in the shadow of mountains older than memory. His voice was low, barely controlled. "And the council? They're dragging their feet," Lena said bitterly. "They'll investigate, form committees, issue statements. Meanwhile, our people are dead." Elias slammed his hand against the table, the impact making the datapad jump. "We can't let this stand. But if we act without proof, we'll be painted as aggressors. So we're just supposed to sit here and take it?" Lena demanded. Her eyes burned with barely restrained fury. "Because that's what they want, Elias. They want us to play by their rules. Rules designed to keep us in chains while they plot our destruction." He met her gaze, seeing his own frustration reflected there. But beneath the anger was something more dangerous, a crack in the foundation of restraint that had held them back for so long. That evening, Elias addressed the council in an emergency session. The chamber was packed, delegates from every corner of the galaxy present to witness the Deathworlder response. Elias spoke with the calm authority of someone used to walking a tightrope over a pit of knives. The attack on Eris 7 was not a random act of violence. He began, his voice steady. It was a calculated assault on our people, orchestrated by those who would see us weakened. We have evidence implicating a major faction, evidence we will present to the council for independent verification. There was a stir among the delegates, Kale Vestran included. His golden feathers puffed slightly, a telltale sign of unease. "We have long abided by the principles of this council," Elias continued. "We have upheld treaties, respected boundaries, and worked tirelessly to prove that we are not the savages some of you believe us to be. But let me be clear, our patience is not limitless. If this body does not act decisively, if it allows this crime to go unpunished, then you leave us no choice but to protect ourselves by any means necessary. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on every being present. The Deathworlders were many things, but they were not given to empty threats. Later, as he left the chamber, Elias felt a hand on his arm. He turned to see Kale, his beady eyes sharp and calculating. "You speak well for a Deathworlder," Kale said, his tone polite but laced with disdain. "But threats will win you no allies here." Elias leaned in close, his voice low and dangerous. "That wasn't a threat, Kale. It was a promise." By the time Elias returned to his quarters, the anger he had held in check all day threatened to consume him. Lena was waiting, her expression unreadable. "Well," she asked. "They're scared," he said, collapsing into a chair. "But they'll stall. They always do." Lena nodded grimly. "Then it's time we stopped pretending." Elias looked at her, seeing in her eyes the truth he had been avoiding. For years, they had played by the galaxy's rules, suppressing their instincts in the hope of fitting in. But those rules had always been a cage, one they had willingly entered for the sake of peace. Now, that cage was breaking, and he wasn't sure if they could, or should, put it back together. "Gather the others," Elias said finally. "If the council won't act, then we will." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. In that moment, Elias knew there was no turning back. They had tried diplomacy, restraint, and civility. Now they would show the galaxy what it truly meant to be a Deathworlder. The atmosphere in the Deathworlders command center buzzed with a tension that could almost be tasted. It was a space carved out of necessity and precision. Cold steel walls adorned with holographic displays that mapped the galaxy in painstaking detail. Figures moved with practiced urgency, their voices low but purposeful as they relayed information and issued orders. At the center of it all stood Lena Voss, her sharp gaze sweeping over the room like a predator assessing the battlefield. Elias entered, his expression grim. He hadn't slept since the council session, and it showed in the lines etched deeper into his face. But there was no time for rest, not when they were on the precipice of a war that could reshape the galaxy. "They've mobilized," Lena said without preamble, nodding toward the largest screen. It displayed a fleet of ships bearing the emblem of the Harith Collective, their formation deliberate and menacing. "They're gathering at the Tarsus Relay. It's a clear message." Elias stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. The Tarsus Relay was a vital hyperspace corridor connecting several major Deathworlder systems. Controlling it meant controlling the flow of resources and reinforcements. The Harith weren't just sending a message. They were issuing a challenge. "They think they can corner us," Elias said, his voice like steel. "Cut us off, force us to capitulate. They don't understand what they've unleashed," Lena replied, a fierce glint in her eyes. Elias turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "How ready are we?" "Ready enough," she said. "Our fleets are moving into position, and our ground forces are prepared for deployment. Every citizen capable of holding a weapon has volunteered. They're tired of waiting, Elias. They're tired of being seen as victims." Elias nodded. He felt the same fire burning in his chest, but he knew it wasn't enough to simply react. They had to think ahead, outmaneuver their enemies at every turn. He stepped closer to the main console, his fingers dancing over the controls as he brought up a detailed map of the Tarsus system. "Here," he said, pointing to a narrow asteroid belt near the relay. "If we stage our fleet along this vector, we can use the debris field to mask our approach. They'll think we're coming straight for the relay, but we'll hit them from the flank." Lena studied the map, a rare smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Classic Deathworlder strategy. Use the environment to our advantage. They won't see it coming." "Good," Elias said, "because we're not just going to beat them. We're going to make them regret ever thinking they could challenge us." The orders went out, and the Deathworlder fleet moved with a precision born of necessity. Their ships were sleek and deadly, built not for aesthetics, but for survival. Each vessel bore the scars of battles fought long before they had joined the Galactic Council, a testament to the resilience of their creators. As the fleet approached the Tarsus relay, tension coiled tighter in every crew member's chest. Elias stood on the bridge of the Resolute, his eyes fixed on the view screen. Around him, his officers worked in silence, their focus absolute. The first shots came before they even reached the asteroid belt. Harith ships emerged from hyperspace, their weapons blazing as they opened fire. The Resolute shuddered under the impact, but Elias barely flinched. "Hold formation," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Stay on course." The Deathworlder ships returned fire, their salvos precise and devastating. Explosions lit up the void as Harith vessels crumbled under the onslaught, but they kept coming, their superior numbers threatening to overwhelm the Deathworlder fleet. Elias watched the battle unfold, his mind racing through possibilities. He could feel the weight of every life on board his ship, every soul fighting for their survival. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. "Commander Voss," he said, turning to Lena, who stood beside him. "It's time." Lena nodded and activated her comms. "All units, execute the flank maneuver. Now!" The fleet shifted, peeling away from the direct assault and diving into the asteroid belt. Harith's ships followed, their commanders confident they had the Deathworlders on the run. But as the Deathworlder ships emerged on the other side, their formation was tighter, their firepower focused. The flank maneuver hit the Harith fleet with surgical precision. Ships exploded in rapid succession, their debris scattering across the battlefield. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks as they realized they had been outmaneuvered. On the bridge of the Resolute, Elias allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. But the battle wasn't over. "Send a message to the Harith flagship," he said. "Let's see if they're willing to talk now." The comms officer nodded, and a moment later, Kale Vestron's face appeared on the view screen. He looked less composed than usual, his feathers ruffled and his eyes wide with barely concealed fear. "This is an act of madness," Kale said, his voice cracking. "Do you realize what you've done?" "We've defended ourselves," Elias replied coldly. "Something you've forced us to do." Kale sputtered, searching for words. "The Council won't stand for this. You'll be branded as aggressors, outcasts." "The Council?" Elias interrupted, his tone sharp. "The Council has done nothing but watch while you plotted our destruction. We don't need their approval to survive." Kale's expression hardened, but the fear never left his eyes. "You've sealed your fate, Wrath. The galaxy will unite against you." Elias leaned closer to the screen, his gaze unwavering. "Let them try." The transmission cut off, and for a moment the bridge was silent. Then Lena spoke, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We've won this battle," she said. "But he's right about one thing. The rest of the galaxy won't take this lying down." Elias nodded, his expression grim. "Let them come. They've mistaken our restraint for weakness for too long. It's time they learned what we're capable of." As the Deathworlder fleet regrouped, preparing for the next phase of the conflict, a quiet resolve settled over the crew. They knew the fight ahead would be harder than anything they had faced before. But they also knew they were done pretending, done hiding the strength that had kept them alive on worlds designed to kill. For Elias, the battle wasn't just about survival. It was about proving to the galaxy that the Deathworlders were more than the labels they had been given. And as he stood on the bridge, staring out into the void, he felt a flicker of hope. Because for the first time, they were fighting on their own terms. The ruins of the Harith capital floated silently in the void, a testament to the Deathworlders' fury. Jagged remnants of ships drifted aimlessly, their once proud banners scorched and tattered. The battle had ended hours ago, but its echoes lingered in the stillness. From the bridge of the Resolute, Elias Wrath stared at the devastation, his expression unreadable. Around him, his crew moved with quiet efficiency, their victory tempered by the weight of what they had unleashed. Lena Voss approached, her boots clicking softly against the floor. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen the worst and survived, but even she seemed subdued as she stood beside Elias. "It's done," she said, her voice low. "The Harith fleet has surrendered. The survivors are requesting terms." Elias nodded, his gaze still fixed on the wreckage. They'll offer reparations, grovel for forgiveness. But it's not enough. They're broken, Lena replied. The message has been sent. The galaxy knows what we're capable of now. Elias turned to her, his eyes dark with something deeper than anger. Do they? Or will they just see this as proof of what they've always feared? That we're monsters waiting for an excuse to destroy everything in our path. Lena met his gaze, unflinching. It doesn't matter what they think. We didn't choose this. They pushed us until we had no choice but to push back. Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe, but every step we take down this road makes it harder to turn back. Before Lena could respond, a comms officer called out from across the bridge. Incoming transmission from the council, sir. Elias exchanged a glance with Lena before nodding. Put it through? The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the familiar chamber of the Galactic Council. The faces of its members were grim, their usual posturing replaced by an air of cautious deference. At their center stood High Arbiter Caliph Thran, an elder statesman whose neutral stance had always concealed a calculating mind. Representative Wrath, Thran began, his voice carefully measured. We have been monitoring the events in the Tarsus sector. The destruction of the Harith fleet and their capital has not gone unnoticed, nor should it, Elias replied, his tone firm but controlled. We acted to defend ourselves against a threat that your council failed to address. The blame for what happened lies squarely with the Harith Collective. Thran inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the point without fully conceding. Be that as it may, the scale of your response has left many in the council concerned. They question whether the Deathworlders are capable of restraint. Elias's expression hardened. Restraint? We showed restraint for decades, abiding by your rules while others conspired against us. Where was your concern when our colonies were attacked, our people slaughtered? We didn't want this war, Arbiter, but we won't apologize for winning it. The chamber fell silent, the weight of Elias's words settling over the gathered delegates. Thran's gaze narrowed, but he nodded again. A fair point, Representative. The Council will convene to discuss the Harith's actions and determine appropriate sanctions. In the meantime, we urge the Deathworlders to temper their approach as we work toward a resolution. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving a quiet tension in its wake. Lena let out a short laugh, humorless and sharp. They're scared out of their minds. Elias shook his head. Scared doesn't mean cooperative. They'll look for ways to control us, to neutralize what they see as a threat. This isn't over, Lena. It's just beginning. Later, in the war room deep within the Resolute, Elias met with the Deathworlder leadership. Scientists, strategists, and military officers gathered around a central table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of holographic maps and data streams. The galaxy will adapt quickly, said Dr. Marin Altos, a leading physicist whose innovations had fueled the Deathworlders' technological edge. They'll start pooling resources, building alliances to counter us. And we'll be ready, Lena said firmly. We've already proven we can outthink and outfight them, but at what cost? Another voice interjected. It was General Reiner Dallin, an elder statesman whose perspective carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. We've won this battle, but if we continue down this path, we risk becoming exactly what they accuse us of, tyrants. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Lena's expression hardened. We're not the ones who started this. If they fear us, it's because they know we won't let them walk over us anymore. And yet fear can be a dangerous thing, Elias said, his voice cutting through the debate. We've shown them what we're capable of, but if we make enemies of the entire galaxy, we won't survive. We need a plan, not just for the next battle, but for what comes after. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. For years, the Deathworlders had fought to prove their place in the galaxy, but now they stood at a crossroads. They could continue to fight, carving out a place for themselves through sheer force. Or they could try to build something new, a balance between strength and diplomacy that would ensure their survival, without losing what made them who they were. Elias looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each face. We've been given a chance to reshape the galaxy, to create a future where no one can threaten us again. But that future won't come from fear alone. It will come from showing the galaxy that we're not just survivors, we're builders. The room erupted in a quiet discussion, plans forming and ideas taking shape. For the first time in weeks, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be hard, but it was a road they could choose for themselves. As the meeting concluded, Elias stepped out onto the observation deck, where the stars stretched endlessly before him. Lena joined him, her presence a steadying force. "Do you really think they'll let us build that future?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Elias smiled faintly, his gaze never leaving the stars. "They don't have a choice. Because if there's one thing the Deathworlders have always known, it's how to survive." Lena nodded, the fire in her eyes tempered but not extinguished. Together, they stood in silence, watching the galaxy they had fought to protect and pondering the battles yet to come.